In this video, we're going to get cooking with n8n by creating our own customized API that outputs a custom message based on the current weather conditions of a given city. Under the hood, we'll learn to use webhooks, access a weather API, and add in some conditional nodes that will dictate what message to output. Don't worry, with n8n it's a lot simpler than it sounds. But first, a quick introduction and why it may be worthwhile to tune in. I started automating systems for the Canadian federal government, saving staff hundreds of labor hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars by automating systems and processes. I quickly became the go-to guy to automate solutions across multiple departments. I now show others how to do the same for the businesses they serve through this channel and my company, Smarter Chats. Now, in my last video, we went over some key fundamentals of n8n, including an overview of the interface, how workflows and nodes work, how to automatically loop through an array or list of data, and how JavaScript is tightly baked into n8n. If you haven't seen that video yet, you can check it out up here. Okay, let's get started. First, let's start by using an n8n template by clicking on the templates link right here. In the search bar, type in city weather, and that'll bring up 4 search results. And we can just grab the one here that says get information about the weather for any city. Let's choose use workflow and import the template into our self-hosted instance. So in this template, we'll access the Openweathermap API, which requires us to get an API key from them. Each account allows you to make 1,000 weather API calls each day for free, which is way more than what you need for this tutorial. You can sign up at home.openweathermap.org and click Create an Account. Enter in a username, an email, and a password. Confirm that you're over 16 years old and agree with their privacy policy and terms and conditions. I already have an account and I've logged in. Now click on API keys at the top here. I already have an existing API key, but if you don't, just create one. You add a name here and you can call this n8n demo, and you click generate, and that'll create an API key for you. So just highlight it and copy it, and go back to the workflow that you imported and click create new Openweathermap credential. Here it'll ask you for your access token, and that's where you just paste in the API key that you just copied, and click save. So we can now close that and we can click continue. Now there are only 3 nodes here, but each one explores an important concept. The first node is a webhook. If you're not familiar with webhooks, they're simply a way of triggering a workflow in n8n when a web URL is accessed. If we double click on this webhook, you can see here we're provided with a URL address. Whenever this URL is accessed, it'll trigger this workflow to run. You can see here that there's 2 versions, a test URL and a production URL. The difference in the URL is simply this -test that's added here for the test URL, and when we click on the production URL, that -test is gone. So the test URL works when you're creating the workflow and testing it out. The production URL works when you activate the workflow. We'll come back to this node shortly. For now, let's go back and look at the Openweathermap node. Now make sure that your Openweathermap API key is selected here, which it should be, like we did in the previous step. And then below that, we can play around with the options, like getting the current weather or the 5-day forecast. We'll leave that as current weather. Choosing the format, whether it's imperial units, metric units, or scientific units. I'm going to leave this as metric. And then the location selection. So in this case, out of all these options, we want to select the city name. So we'll leave that as is. Now we could specify a city name here, but in our case, we're going to dynamically specify the city through the webhook. Now every n8n node has a settings tab here. The options are generally the same for all nodes, things like always output the data, execute once, retry on fail. There's some error handling options here, and you can add a note, which you can display in the workflow canvas. I'll go into more details about node settings in a future video. Let's go back to the webhook node. Now normally I would tell you to copy this test webhook URL by clicking on it, opening a new browser, pasting it in and pressing enter, and you would see some kind of message here saying that you've connected to the test webhook URL. But in my case, it says it can't even access that URL. And the reason for that is because if you recall from a previous video, I had set up my n8n instance using a template that looks like this, and it has its own webhook processor service. And that causes some issues when you're testing webhooks. If you set up n8n any other way, you won't have this problem, and this test webhook URL would work as it should. But if you have n8n set up like I do on Railway, where there is its own webhook processor, what you need to do is go back to your n8n instance and copy the subdomain, in my case, which is primary-production-e51f. And I'm going to copy that. And then I'm going to go to that browser that I had opened up. And I'm going to replace the beginning subdomain here with the one that I had copied. So I'm just going to paste that in and then press enter. And that's when it will test out my test webhook URL. But I get a 404 error message here. Why? Well, we need to have the test webhook running. So we need to click here, listen for test event. You'll see it says listening for test event. And then if I go back to the browser where I was testing it and I refresh it, you'll see a bunch of text here. And that means that the trigger is working. And if I go back to n8n, you can see a bunch of output that's now shown up on the right side of the webhook. Great, so we know the webhook trigger is working. Now let's go back and look at the set node here. This set node is also called edit fields in n8n. And what it does is it extracts specific desired values from the output data that was provided in the previous node. And we can see in this node that it's extracting the temperature, the humidity, the wind speed, the description, and the city. So let's go back and test this entire workflow. So down at the bottom of the workflow canvas, we can see this button that says test workflow. And if I click on it, it changes to waiting for trigger event. So if I go back to my Webhook test browser here and I refresh the page, I get an error message. It says message error in workflow. Now, if I go back to n8n and see what the problem is, I get this error message that says problem in node Openweathermap, bad request, please check your parameters. So you can see here that the webhook triggered correctly, but where it failed is in the Openweathermap node. So if I double click on this, we can see that there's an error message in the output. It says bad request, please check your parameters. There's nothing to geocode. And the problem is that it's looking for a city name somewhere in the data of the webhook, but we're not providing that city name. And we can see here in the query that it's actually blank. There's nothing here. So it doesn't know what city we're trying to specify. So that's the problem. So if I go back and click test workflow, and then I go back to the test webhook URL browser here, I'm going to try putting in city equals, let's just say Tokyo, and I press enter. And now I still get an error in the workflow. So let's go back and try to troubleshoot this. So again, it's failing. It succeeds in the webhook, but it fails at the Openweathermap API. So if I go back, we can see that it says bad request again, and this city is still showing up as red. But we can see here that in the query parameters, a city did show up and we specified Tokyo. So it is pulling up properly. So I think the problem is I'm going to delete this and I'm actually going to drag this city variable into the city here. And sure enough, we can see it says Tokyo. The JSON dot notation should have been JSON.query.city. So that should make it work. Let's go back, test this workflow, go back to the test webhook URL here, refresh the page because we do have city equals Tokyo here. Let's press refresh. And sure enough, we have the temperature, the humidity, the wind speed, the description. It says few clouds, and the city is in fact Tokyo, Japan. And if we go back to n8n, we can see that there's check marks on all three nodes, which means that this whole workflow has executed successfully. Now, if I go back to this test URL and I change the city to New York, for example, and I press enter, we get that 404 error message. And the reason for that is because whenever we're in a testing environment, the webhook has to get triggered manually every single time. So every time we click test workflow, we can only trigger it one time. So in this case, I'll do New York. It'll give me the information for New York. But if we go back, that test is now done, and it only works that one time. It is, after all, just for testing purposes. If I want the webhook to continually run as a service, I need to activate this workflow and switch to the production URL webhook, which will always be actively listening. So to do that, up at the top right here, we have this inactive switch. And so if I turn this on, we'll get a pop-up window that says workflow activated. You can now make calls to your production webhook URL. These executions will not show up immediately in the editor, but you can see them in the execution list if you choose to save executions. So I'll click Got It. You can see now that the toggle is green and it says it's active. And if I double click on the webhook node here, I can look at the production URL, which is this. I'll copy it. I'll open a new browser, paste it in. And if I press enter, again, it says error in workflow. So of course I need to add the city. So I'll do city equals Vancouver, press enter. And sure enough, we have all the information for Vancouver, Canada. And if I go back to the n8n instance, we can see that again, all three have green check marks. So now we have a full working n8n API that anyone can use by simply entering this URL that triggers the n8n workflow. Hey, I just wanted to quickly pause to ask if you could help me out and hit the like button for this video. A simple gesture like that would go a long way and I would really appreciate it. Go ahead and hit that like button now. Let's extend this template by looking at outputting some appropriate text based on the current weather conditions. To do this, we can use one of two conditional nodes, if or switch. If I add a new node here and I type in if, we can see the top two results are if and switch. The if node is appropriate when we want to check one single condition to be either true or false, and direct the workflow between these two possible branches. Either the condition proves true or the condition proves false. So as an example, I might drag in the temperature into value 1 and say number is greater than 20 degrees Celsius. And I could leave it like that, or I could add a condition. So if I did add a condition, I could say, so if the temperature is greater than 20 degrees and the temperature is less than, so I'll say less than 30 degrees, for example, and I go back. So you can see that it says if true or if false. So in this example, if the temperature is between 20 and 30 degrees, that would go in the true route. But if the temperature is not between 20 and 30 degrees, it would then go on the false route. The if node is perfect for one single scenario that will prove either true or false. I'm just going to delete this and show you the switch node. So if I click, again, type if, and I choose switch. So the switch node is appropriate when we have multiple conditions and want to direct the workflow to one of many branches, depending on which condition proves true. So if I wanted to output a singular message based on one particular weather condition, I would use the if node. So in this case, since I want to output multiple different messages based on multiple different weather conditions, I'm going to use the switch node, which better suits my needs. So in the switch node, there are two modes, rules and expression. Rules is the default, which we'll use here. Expression mode is when you want to type the conditions out as JavaScript code, as indicated by the double curly braces here. This might be useful when you have more complex logic that perhaps you can only achieve when you're using some code. But let's keep it simple and use the rules mode in this video. The next step is to add a routing rule. Now it's important to note that these rules are evaluated from top to bottom, so the order of your rules may be important. The moment one of your rules evaluates to true, it will direct to that route and ignore any of the other rules after it. So it's best practice to start with your most narrow and important rules first, and then end with your broadest rules. So for my first rule, I want to check if the weather description contains the word rain. And if it does, I want to output a message to say something along the lines of, there may be rain, bring an umbrella. So I'm going to drag the description, which is what would contain the word rain, and put that into value 1. And then I'm going to drop down this and say the string should contain the word rain. So that's my first routing rule. So I'm going to add another routing rule. So for this second rule, I'm going to say if the temperature is less than, say, 10 degrees Celsius, I want to say that it's going to be a chilly day, so dress warm. So I'm going to drag the temperature variable here into value 1, and I'm going to say as a number, it has to be less than, and I'll say 10 degrees. I'm going to add another routing rule, and in this third rule, I'm going to say if the temperature is greater than 20 degrees, I want to say it's t-shirt weather. Hey, I live in Canada, so if it's over 20 degrees, I'm definitely in a t-shirt. So again, I'm going to drag the temperature into value 1. I'm going to choose number and is greater than, and put in 20 for 20 degrees. Now I'm going to add one last rule. This fourth rule is going to be a default catch-all rule. If nothing else gets triggered by this point, it should display this last message. So to do this, I want to add a rule that will always evaluate to true. So I could do something like drag the temperature into value 1, and I'm going to say as a number exists. So if the temperature exists, then it should be true. I can also say something like put in a 0 here, and if 0 exists, then it's true, and so that'll always prove to be true. And I can see this is showing up as red, so I think it's because it's set as an expression. So if I say fixed, that'll probably fix it. So if 0 is there and it exists, then it's true. What's important here is making sure that it always evaluates to true, so that if it goes through all of these routing rules and none of them prove to be true, then there is one at the very end that will be the default. Now, the other thing I can add is under add option, I can have a fallback output. And in this case, if I drop this down, I can choose the very last one, which is the 0 exists. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. It starts with 0, and that's why it's output 3. That's the fourth option, and that'll be the fallback output. So if I go up and I click test step, we can see that there's the 4 different routing options, output 0, 1, 2, and 3. And in this case, because the temperature is 18.2 degrees and the description is fog, all of these first 3 options failed. So there's no rain in the description, it's not less than 10 degrees, and it's not greater than 20 degrees. So we can see the result is in output 3, which is the last one. The last thing we can do with this switch node is we can rename the outputs. So in this case, if I wanted to rename this, I could call this one rain, for example, and you can see it's actually changing there. This one's rain, this one is less than 10, greater than 20, and maybe this is like default. So if I wanted to rename these, I can do that there. And what would happen is in any future nodes, it'll reference these as the values instead of like output 0, output 1, output 2. But in my case, I'm going to leave them all as the default names. So if I go back to the workflow canvas, we can see here that the switch node has 4 different route options. We now want to handle each of these routes by displaying the output message based on the criteria we had specified. But before I do that, let's test this workflow one more time so that I can grab the data that comes from the API. So if I go to the testing webhook URL and I type in Vancouver here, press enter. Now we're no longer seeing any of that JSON output that we saw before. And the reason for that is because we've added a switch which now does nothing. So it's not outputting anything. But what we can see here is if we double click on this set node, we can see that the weather data for Vancouver has been captured. And what I'll do is I'll pin this data so that I don't have to constantly be querying this webhook in order to get the data. And if I double click on this switch node, we can see that the last option is the one that proved to be true for this weather data. So I'm going to start with this last option here, and I'm going to add respond to webhook. There's a lot of things we can choose to respond with, but in my case, I'm going to keep it simple and I'm just going to choose some text because I want to specify some specific text if it ends up being the default route that it doesn't fit under any of the other options. So what I'll say is it's, and then I'm going to grab the temperature, degrees Celsius, that's how you spell Celsius, in and then let's drag the city in. And then I'll say with, and we'll add the description, put in a period, and then maybe I'll just say, just another typical day. Have a great one. So this text will output for the default catch-all route. And so if I go test the workflow again and go back to my test webhook URL, refresh for Vancouver, it's giving me back the JSON output again. So there's this warning message at the very top of this respond to webhook node that says, verify that the webhook node's respond parameter is set to using respond to webhook node. So let me go back to the original webhook, go into that node, and there's a respond option here. And if I drop this down, I have to choose using respond to webhook node. So if I go back, test this workflow again, go to the test webhook URL, refresh the page, and there we go. There's the message. It's 13.77 degrees Celsius in Vancouver, Canada, with scattered clouds. Just another typical day. Have a great one. So I'm going to go and copy this message and then go through each of these nodes. So the first one here, I'm going to do respond to webhook again. I'm going to choose text. I'm going to paste in this message. But if you recall, this one is if the word rain shows up in the description. So I'm going to say, it might rain, make sure to take an umbrella. So that's the first one. Then I'm going to respond to webhook here. This is the second option. So again, choose text. I'm going to paste in the text I had. And this rule was when the temperature was less than 10 degrees. So I'll say it might get chilly, dress warm. So that's for that one. And the last one, I'll add the respond to webhook again here. Choose text, paste in what I had. And this one is the one if it's over 20 degrees. So I'll just say it's t-shirt weather. And that's that. So let me try to arrange this so it looks a little bit more visible. Okay, so those are the 4 different options. And if I save this, now if I go to the production webhook URL, I should be able to type in !city Vancouver. And there we go. That's the default one. That's the catch-all. Let me see if I can do, let's say Miami. Uh-oh, what happened here? Let me go back. It's because I had this pinned. So I typed in Miami, it was getting something different, but it knows that I still had this as Vancouver. So let me unpin this, save that, go back here. Let me refresh the Miami page. That fix it? No. Okay, so here's the problem. If I just double click on this node here, this is set to fixed. So it's literally typing out all the text here. What we want that to be is an expression. So that should fix it. Let me just double check that these ones, yeah, this one also needs to be an expression, and this should be an expression. Okay, so they're all expressions. Let me save this, go back to the webhook, and refresh this as the city Miami, and there we go. It's 28 degrees almost Celsius in Miami, and it's t-shirt weather. So let me choose another city. Let me say Helsinki, 16 degrees, okay. It might rain, oh. With light rain, it might rain. Make sure to take an umbrella. Hey, there we go. And there's a place that's kind of cold. Anchorage, 10 degrees. Oh, but light rain again. Might rain. Take an umbrella. Someplace colder. Let me say Calgary. Still above. What place might be less than 10 degrees? Yellowknife, 8.6 degrees with clear skies. It might get chilly. Dress warm. Okay, so there you have it. In this workflow, we created our own custom API using n8n. We looked at 5 important nodes. The webhook node is a common workflow trigger that gets triggered through a web URL. The Openweathermap API node queries a weather API and returns weather data based on a specified city. We looked at the if and switch nodes to direct workflows to different routes based on a specified criteria. And lastly, we looked at the respond to webhook node, which allows us to output specific data or a message of our choosing. I hope this helped to build up your n8n skills so you can build some amazing API-driven automations. Please remember to like this video and check out my next video in this tutorial series, where we continue to build on the concepts in n8n, including how we can modify this existing workflow using different variations of different nodes. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.